My mother-in-law said no girl had ever survived her husband's bloodline. Then she slapped me, threw a glass globe at my head, and broke into my house. 8 months pregnant to end her own granddaughter. The doorknob turned slow, like someone testing ice. I stood in the corner of my bedroom, with one hand flat against the wall, and one hand cupped under my belly. 8 months pregnant, and I did not make a sound. "Come out, dear," Judith said through the door, her voice gentle in a way that made my skin crawl worse than shouting would have. "Let's handle this like the family always has. It doesn't have to hurt if you stop fighting it." Downstairs had gone quiet 10 seconds earlier. Quiet was worse than the crashing had been. Quiet meant Weston wasn't yelling anymore, and I didn't know if that meant he'd won or if it meant something I couldn't let myself finish thinking. I had my phone against my ear, dispatch still on the line, my voice down to a whisper. "She's at the door. She's alone right now. I don't know where my husband is. Officers are 2 minutes out, ma'am. Stay on the line. 2 minutes." I did math I had no business doing at a time like that. How many seconds in 2 minutes? How many seconds a woman needs to get through a locked door when she's already broken into a house once tonight? The knob stopped turning. For a moment, I thought she'd given up. Then the wood near the frame cracked, once like a gunshot, and I understood she'd found something to use as a crowbar. "Every woman who brought daughters into this family learned their place eventually," Judith said, calm as a woman reading a recipe. "Dead or disappeared. It's your turn to choose which." I backed further into the corner. There was nowhere else to go. The window was 30 feet above the driveway. My daughter Marlo was 4 years old and asleep at my sister's house 2 towns over, and the daughter still inside me hadn't done anything to anyone except exist, and somehow that was the whole crime Judith couldn't forgive. The door gave. Wood splintered off the frame and swung wide, and Judith Calloway, 61 years old, silver hair pinned back the way she wore it to church, blood already on the cuff of her cardigan from something that happened downstairs, came through it with both hands out in front of her like she meant to grab my stomach with them. I didn't scream. I want that on the record, because for the rest of my life people have asked me if I screamed, and I didn't. I threw the only thing in reach, which was the lamp off the nightstand, and it caught her across the shoulder and did almost nothing, and she kept coming, and I thought very clearly, in a voice that didn't sound like panic at all, "This is the moment. This is the one Preston tried to warn us was coming." To understand how a 61-year-old grandmother ended up breaking down her own son's bedroom door with her hands already stained from a fight downstairs, you have to go back 4 years to a wedding reception in a rented barn outside Zanesville, Ohio, where a woman I had known for exactly 11 months grabbed my wrist hard enough to leave 4 crescent marks and told me what she expected me to give her family. I was 26 the day I married Weston Calloway. He was 28. We'd met at a continuing education conference in Columbus. I taught high school biology, he managed the books for his family's business, and what I remember most about those first months wasn't romance, exactly. It was relief. Weston was steady. He called when he said he'd call. He didn't play games. After 2 relationships that had worn me down to nothing, steady felt like the rarest thing in the world. I met Judith for the first time 4 months into dating Weston, at a Sunday dinner in Zanesville that Weston had built up for 2 straight weeks like it was a job interview. She was warm that first night, almost aggressively so. She'd made a roast, asked me a dozen questions about my classroom, told a long story about Weston's tonsillectomy at age 6 that made him groan and made me laugh. Only once did something odd slip through. Weston mentioned in passing that his cousin's wife had just had her 3rd boy in a row, and Judith set down her serving spoon and said, "Well, that's how it's supposed to go," in a tone so flat I almost missed it under the clatter of dishes. I filed it away as nothing. Families have their odd little sayings. I had no way of knowing yet that this particular family's odd little sayings had a body count. The Calloway family had run a funeral home in Zanesville since 1889. Calloway and Sons, the sign said, gold letters on black, and it had passed from father to son for 5 generations without a single break in that line, which Weston's mother Judith considered less a coincidence than a covenant. Judith had married into the family in 1975 at 20, and by the time I met her, she had spent nearly 5 decades absorbing the mythology the way some people absorb a religion, completely, without room for doubt, and with a low simmering resentment toward anyone who questioned it. We married in September of 2019 in a rented barn 20 minutes outside Zanesville. String lights strung between the rafters, 70 guests, a bluegrass trio Weston's college roommate had put together for the occasion. My side of the family took up maybe a third of the room. I'm an only child, my parents divorced young, and most of my guests were cousins and old friends from the school where I taught. The Calloway side filled the rest, generations of them, great uncles and second cousins I'd meet exactly once and never see again, all of them at some point finding a way to mention the funeral home, the 5 generations, the Sons. Judith gave a toast near the end of the night, glass raised, and said she was grateful the family line would continue in good hands, and everyone laughed and clapped like it was an ordinary thing to say at a wedding, and I clapped too, because I didn't yet know what continue the line actually meant to the woman saying it. The wedding reception was where I first heard it stated as fact instead of family joke. Later that same night, once the toasts were finished and the dancing had started, Judith found me near the gift table, took my wrist in a grip that surprised me with its strength, and said, "Now make us our son, don't let us down." I laughed because I thought it was a toast, a slightly old-fashioned mother-in-law joke about grandchildren. She didn't laugh. She held my wrist another 2 seconds, looking at me the way you'd look at a horse you were deciding whether to buy, and then let go and walked back to her table. I told Weston in the car that night. He winced. She's from a different generation, he said. My grandmother used to say the same thing to my mom. It's a family thing. It's not, she doesn't mean anything cruel by it. I believed him because I wanted to, and because Judith spent our first year of marriage being nothing but warm. She sent recipe cards. She called on Sundays. She cried, genuinely cried, the day we told her I was pregnant with our first child, and for about 6 months I thought maybe I'd misread that wedding day comment entirely. Marlo was born in April of 2020, 7 pounds 4 ounces, a full head of dark hair like her father's. Judith held her at the hospital for exactly 4 minutes before handing her back and said, "She's beautiful," in a voice that had already gone somewhere else. At the christening 2 months later, over a table of deviled eggs and green bean casserole, she looked at Marlo's profile and said, soft, almost sweet, like a joke she expected me to laugh along with. Wonder where she got that nose. Not from our side. I let it go. She was 60 by then, recently diagnosed with a heart arrhythmia that had scared the whole family, and I told myself a woman under that kind of stress says things she doesn't mean. Weston wasn't at that dinner. He'd stepped out to help his father move folding chairs, and when I told him later, he sighed and said he'd talk to her, and I don't know if he ever did because the comments didn't stop. They came dressed as jokes for 2 more years. Wonder where she got that temper. Must skip a generation. She's got your coloring, thank God. At least she's got that. 6 months after the christening, Judith showed up at our house unannounced with a garment box under her arm, the kind of visit she used to make often back then, before things soured. Inside, wrapped in tissue, was a christening gown. Antique lace, yellowed at the hem, clearly decades old. "This has been in the family since 1931, she said, laying it across our kitchen table like she was presenting something sacred. "Every Callaway boy has worn it. I want it ready for next time." I told her gently that we weren't planning a next time anytime soon, that Marlo was barely 6 months old. Judith smiled, folded the tissue paper back over the gown with practiced hands, and said, "Well, we'll just keep it ready. God willing, you'll get it right." She left the box on our table and drove home, and I stood there for a long moment looking at a christening gown meant for a child that didn't exist yet, sewn for a gender we hadn't chosen and couldn't have chosen if we'd tried, and felt something cold settle low in my stomach that I didn't have words for at the time. I put the box in the attic. I didn't tell Weston how it made me feel, because I still didn't have the vocabulary for what was wrong with his mother, only the vague, persistent sense that something was. The specific incident that should have told me everything happened in October of 2022, 18 months before the night with the glass globe. Weston and I had driven out to the funeral home to drop off dinner for his father, who'd been working late on a difficult service, and while Weston was in the back with Harold, I waited in the front office and, out of boredom more than curiosity, opened the leather-bound ledger that sat on the reception desk. It was the family record, client rosters going back decades, handwritten in 3 or 4 different sets of handwriting as the business changed hands. I flipped toward the back out of idle interest and found the year 1953. 2 names had been entered in a careful, old-fashioned script, Faith Callaway and Grace Callaway, and then both names had been struck through with a single hard line, no explanation, no notation of services rendered, which was strange, because every other entry in that ledger, going back to 1889, included a date, a cause, a plot number. These 2 had nothing, just names, and a line through them, like someone had crossed out a mistake instead of recording a death. I asked Harold about it later that night, mostly making conversation. His face did something I'd never seen it do, a kind of controlled blankness, like a door closing very carefully so it wouldn't slam. "Old family business," he said. "Before my time, really. Judith would know more than me." I brought it up to Judith exactly once, at a Thanksgiving dinner a month later, phrased as harmless curiosity. Who were Faith and Grace? I'd seen the names in the old ledger. Judith's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. She set it down with a small, precise click against the plate. "Some things are better left where they are," she said, and then she asked Weston to pass the rolls, and the conversation moved on so smoothly that I almost convinced myself I'd imagined the look on her face. There was one more incident before I put the ledger out of my mind entirely, and at the time it seemed unrelated, a business matter, nothing more. In January of 2023, Harold called Weston into the funeral home office to talk through the succession paperwork, the legal documents that would eventually transfer ownership shares once Harold retired. Weston came home that night quiet, distracted, and told me Judith had been in the room for the whole conversation, which was unusual. She rarely involved herself in the financial side. At one point, apparently, she'd interrupted Harold mid-sentence and said, apropos of nothing, that the ownership language should specify sons, the way it always had, in case anything changes down the road. Harold had brushed it off, told her the paperwork would list Weston by name, regardless of what children he had, and Judith had gone quiet and let the subject drop. Weston mentioned it to me almost as an afterthought, more confused than alarmed, and I remember saying something like, "That's a strange thing to fight about," and neither of us thought much more of it, in case anything changes down the road. I understand now that she wasn't talking about the business at all. I didn't think about the ledger, or the succession comment, again for a year and a half. I had no reason to. That's the thing about foreshadowing when you're the one living inside the story instead of watching it. It doesn't announce itself. It just sits there, waiting, while you go on with your life. By early 2024, I was pregnant again, and this time we decided to wait until 20 weeks, until we knew for certain, before we we told anyone. We found out at the anatomy scan that we were having another girl. I remember sitting in the parking lot of the imaging center with Weston, both of us crying a little, both of us happy, and I remember him saying, only half joking, we should tell my mom over the phone, just in case. I laughed. I thought he was being dramatic. He was not being dramatic. We called Judith and Harold together on speaker the following Sunday. Harold said congratulations, sounded genuinely pleased. There was a pause after that, the kind of pause you feel before you hear it, and then Judith started to cry. Not happy tears, ugly hard sobbing that took over the whole call. Not ours, she said, in between breaths. Those girls aren't ours. She's a cheater. Weston went rigid on the couch next to me. I sat there with my hand over my mouth, 11 weeks past the scan, still holding the printout of our daughter's profile, and listened to my husband's mother accuse me of infidelity because our second child had 2 X chromosomes instead of 1. Weston stood up so fast the coffee table shook. That's it, he said into the phone, and his voice had a crack running through it I'd never heard before, somewhere between fury and heartbreak. We're done. You don't get to talk to her like that. You don't get to talk about my daughter like that. Judith kept crying, saying something about tradition, about 100 years, about how she'd only ever wanted what was best for this family. And Weston said the thing that ended up on every version of this story anyone ever told afterward. I love that little girl more than I ever loved you. And then he hung up, and we didn't speak to his parents for 3 months. 3 months of nothing. No calls, no cards, no Sunday check-ins. I won't pretend it was easy. Weston grieved that silence even while he stood by it. I'd find him some nights sitting with his phone in his hand, not calling, just holding it, like the weight of the decision needed somewhere to rest. Marlo asked about her grandmother twice, and each time Weston told her Grandma Judith was busy, and each time I watched something in his face fold up a little smaller. The silence didn't stay contained to our house, though. In early July, 6 weeks into it, I ran into a woman named Carol Ann Prewitt at the grocery store in Zanesville, someone I knew loosely from the church Judith and Harold attended, back when we still went with them on holidays. Carol Ann gave me a strange, pitying look over the produce and said, "How are you holding up, honey? Judith's told us all what you're going through." I asked what exactly Judith had told them. Carol Ann hesitated, then said gently, like she was trying to be kind about it, that Judith had mentioned to the prayer circle that our marriage was under strain, that there'd been some question about the new baby, that she was praying for the family to find its way through a difficult season. I stood there in the produce aisle, 8 months from becoming a mother of 2, and understood that Judith had spent 6 weeks quietly telling an entire congregation that I was a cheater, dressed up in language soft enough that no one who heard it could quite call it slander, even though that's exactly what it was. I told Carol Ann there was no question about anything, that the only difficult season in our family had been caused by one person, and I left my cart half full in the aisle and cried in my car for 10 minutes before I could drive home. I told Weston that night. He went very still, the way he did whenever his mother found a new way to disappoint him, and said he'd handle it, though there wasn't much handling to be done against a rumor that had already made its way through 40 families at a Sunday potluck. It was Harold who finally reached out in late July asking if we'd consider one dinner, just one. He said Judith had been different, quieter, that her heart had been giving her real trouble, and the cardiologist had used words like arrhythmia and stress-related episode, and that whatever she was still Marlo's only living grandmother on his side, and didn't a 4-year-old deserve the chance to know that? I was 32 weeks pregnant by then, tired in the specific way you're tired at the end of a summer carrying a second child, and I wanted, badly, for this to be fixable. Weston wanted it more. He agreed to one dinner at his parents' house with conditions. No comments about the baby, no comments about paternity, no comments about tradition. Harold promised. I should have known a promise made on someone else's behalf isn't worth the air it's spoken into. We drove out on a Saturday evening in the second week of August, 8 months pregnant. Marlo buckled into her booster seat singing along to the radio, completely unaware she was headed toward the house where everything would break. I remember thinking, pulling into the driveway, that the yard looked exactly the way it always had. Harold's tomato plants staked along the fence, the same ceramic frog by the porch steps Marlo used to talk to when she was a toddler, and how strange it was that a place could look so unchanged while everyone inside it had shifted so far. Dinner started fine, almost too fine. Judith had made pot roast. Harold poured wine for the adults and lemonade for Marlo, and for 20 minutes, I let myself believe we might actually get through the evening. Judith asked Marlo about kindergarten, complimented my maternity dress, asked Weston about the funeral home's spring numbers, all of it so ordinary that I caught myself relaxing my shoulders for the first time in 3 months. Harold kept glancing at his wife between bites, the way you watch weather you don't quite trust, and I understand now he'd spent the whole afternoon extracting a promise from her that she had no intention of keeping. Marlo finished her lemonade and asked if she could be excused to look at the ceramic frog outside, and Judith told her to stay seated a little longer. "Sweetheart, we're not quite finished," in a voice so pleasant it should have been the first warning. Then Judith set down her fork, folded her hands on the table in front of her plate, and said, in that same gentle, reasonable voice she'd used to ask someone to pass the salt, "I want paternity tests before this baby is born." The table went silent except for Marlo humming to herself over her mashed potatoes, too young to understand what had just detonated over her head. I stood up. I didn't yell. I want to be honest about that, because for years afterward, Judith would tell anyone who'd listen that I attacked her first, and it isn't true. I stood up to leave because I wasn't going to sit at a dinner table while a woman accused me of cheating on my husband in front of our daughter, and Judith grabbed the hem of my shirt in her fist before I'd taken a full step. "You're not running from this, cheater," she said, and the gentleness was gone entirely now, replaced by something raw and furious that had clearly been sitting under the surface the whole meal, maybe the whole 3 months. Then she slapped me across the face, hard enough that my ears rang, hard enough that Harold shot up out of his chair and Marlo started to cry. Weston was between us in a second, physically shoving his mother back, shouting something I couldn't process through the ringing in my head, and we turned for the door. I remember reaching for Marlo, getting her out of the booster seat, holding her against my hip even 8 months pregnant because I needed her in my arms, and that's when Judith reached up onto the entryway shelf, grabbed the glass snow globe that had sat there since before I ever met this family, and threw it. It caught me above the eyebrow. I went down onto one knee in the entryway with Marlo screaming and clinging to my neck, blood running warm down the side of my face and into my collar, both hands instinctively wrapping around my belly instead of the wound, because some animal part of my brain had already decided which of us mattered more in that moment. Judith tried to get past Weston to kick me while I was on the ground. I remember the shoe, brown leather, aimed at my hip, and Weston's arm blocking it, and Harold somewhere behind all of it saying, "Judith, Judith, stop," in a voice that had gone thin and old. Weston got Marlo and me into the car. I remember very little of the drive to the hospital, except the sound of my own daughter crying in the back seat, and Weston's hand shaking on the wheel, and my own voice, strangely calm, telling him to run the red light on Route 40 because I didn't want to wait for it. 6 stitches above my eyebrow, 4 days of fetal monitoring, because the trauma team wanted to be certain the baby hadn't been affected by the fall or the adrenaline spike. She was fine. Her heart rate never dropped below normal range the entire time, which the nurse told me twice. Like she understood I needed to hear it twice before I'd believe it. The police came to the hospital to take my statement. A young officer named Reyes sat beside my bed with a notepad, asking careful, unhurried questions, and I remember being surprised by how calm my own voice sounded describing it. The shirt, the slap, the globe, the shoe aimed at my hip, like I was reading someone else's incident report out loud. Marlo sat in the chair across the room the whole time, quiet, watching me with an expression too old for a 4-year-old, and at one point she asked, in a small voice, if Grandma Judith was going to time out. I told her yes. I didn't know yet how true that would turn out to be. 2 days later, they arrested Judith. Harold had broken 2 fingers trying to pull her off me at the door. The responding officers pieced that together from the bruising pattern and Harold's own halting explanation, and when they pressed Judith on what had actually happened in that entryway, she admitted the whole sequence herself, unprompted, almost proudly, like she believed once the officers understood the family's traditions, they'd see her side of it. They arrested her instead. Aggravated assault. Domestic violence enhancement, given the relationship and my pregnancy. She spent that first night in the county jail 40 minutes from the hospital where I was still hooked up to a monitor, and I lay there in that hospital bed with a bandage over my eyebrow and my daughter, the healthy one already born, asleep in a chair beside me, and I thought foolishly that the worst of it was over. The calls started the next morning. Jail phones only allow so many minutes, and Judith used every one of them on us. Weston let the first 3 go to voicemail. On the 4th, he picked up, mostly, I think, because Harold had texted him begging him to just listen to what she had to say, and I sat next to the hospital bed with my hand on my stomach and listened to my husband's mother beg him, from a jail phone, to drop the charges. I panicked, she said, loud enough that I could hear the tinny edges of it through the speaker. "You know I love that little girl. I love both of them. I wasn't in my right mind, Weston. My heart's been doing that thing again. The doctor said stress could—" "You threw a glass globe at my wife's head," Weston said. His voice had gone very flat, the voice of a man reading a verdict rather than arguing a case. "She's 8 months pregnant. You could have killed the baby. Your lucky assault is the only thing you're charged with." He hung up before she could answer. We scheduled the paternity test 2 days later, not because either of us had a shred of doubt, but because Weston wanted to mail her the results somewhere she couldn't pretend she hadn't received them. "Here's your proof," he said out loud while he sealed the envelope, like he was rehearsing the line for a version of Judith who wasn't 300 miles from being able to hear him. "You'll never meet your granddaughters." I watched him write the county jail's address on the front in block letters and felt something in my chest that wasn't quite satisfaction and wasn't quite grief, some cousin of both. It was Preston who called 2 nights later and pulled the floor out from under everything I thought I understood about this family. Preston was Harold's nephew, Weston's first cousin, a soft-spoken accountant in Cleveland who'd never had much to do with the Zanesville side of the family beyond holiday cards. I answered because Weston was in the shower, and Preston asked for him with an urgency that made me put him on speaker and go get Weston, dripping, out of the bathroom. "There's something you need to know," Preston said once we were both listening. "My grandmother, your great-aunt Louise, told me some of this before she died, back in 2019. I didn't know what to do with it. I still don't, really, but after what happened at dinner, I think you need to hear it." He took a breath I could hear even through the phone. "The no girls thing, it's a lie. It's always been a lie." He told us about a great-aunt named Mabel, born into the Calloway family in 1899, who'd had a daughter in 1917 out of wedlock and been quietly sent to a relative in Pittsburgh for the final months of her pregnancy. The baby had been given up for adoption there, and the official family record was rewritten to say Mabel had suffered a miscarriage. They didn't didn't want the shame of an unmarried daughter having a daughter, Preston said. 2 daughters in one scandal. My grandmother said Eleanor, your great-grandmother Weston, was the one who arranged it. Eleanor ran the funeral home practically single-handed by the time she was in her 30s, and she ran the family the same way. Then he told us about 1953. Twin girls, born to a woman named Ruth who'd married into the family. Eleanor's daughter-in-law, 2 generations before Judith took that same position. My grandmother said the family told everyone both babies died in infancy. There was even a small service. But Louise said Eleanor confided in her once, years later, drunk on Christmas sherry, that only one baby had actually died. The other was given to a family 2 counties over, and Eleanor made sure Ruth never saw either of them again, dead or alive. Louise said it broke Ruth. She was institutionalized within 2 years and died in a state hospital in 1961. Preston's voice cracked on that last date. Eleanor called it handling the situation. That's the word my grandmother used. Handling. I thought about the ledger. Faith and grace. Struck through with one hard line, no cause of death, no plot number. Because there was no plot. Because at least one of them had never died at all. I told Weston about it that night for the first time in full. The detail I'd tucked away 18 months earlier as nothing more than an odd little mystery. And I watched him go pale in a way I'd never seen on him. Not even at the hospital. Judith knows, Preston said before we hung up. She has to know. Eleanor was her mother-in-law too. Somebody taught her this. Nobody invents a superstition that specific on their own. Weston asked him how certain he was, whether any of it could be verified beyond an old woman's deathbed memory. Preston went quiet for a second, then admitted he'd already wondered the same thing. And 2 years earlier, after his grandmother's funeral, he'd spent an evening searching the Muskingum County newspaper archive online, mostly out of guilt for not asking Louise more questions while she was alive. He'd found a single line in the Zanesville Times Recorder from March of 1953, a births and deaths notice listing 1 infant Calloway, female, survived by parents, no name given, no funeral details, which was strange in itself for a family that owned the town's largest funeral home and buried everyone who mattered to them with a full service and a headstone. 1 infant, Preston said, not 2. If both of them had really died, there'd have been 2 names, 2 services, 2 stones in the family plot. I checked the plot myself. There's only 1 small marker from that year, and it just says infant Calloway. No first name at all. Weston sat down hard on our kitchen chair while Preston talked, and I understood we'd just moved from a family rumor into something closer to a paper trail, and paper trails, unlike deathbed confessions, don't go away when the person who told you about them dies. Judith knows, Preston said again, quieter this time. She has to know. Eleanor was her mother-in-law too. Somebody taught her this. Nobody invents a superstition that specific on their own. That night, close to 11, Judith called from jail again, and this time Weston answered on speaker without hesitation, some new, colder resolve in his face that told me he wanted a witness. I'm not the first to handle daughters properly, Judith said. No preamble, no apology this time. Her voice stripped of the pleading tone from 2 days earlier and replaced with something almost serene. Handle, check your mail. The line went dead. Weston stood in the kitchen holding the phone like it had bitten him. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show linked in the description for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. The package arrived the next afternoon. No return address. Postmarked from a shipping store in Zanesville that Judith must have arranged through someone on the outside before her arrest. We found out later it was her brother Frank who'd mailed it at her instruction over the phone. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that had gone yellow with age, were 2 tiny hospital identification bracelets. The paper inserts brittle and curling at the edges, the names on them scratched out with something sharp enough to tear the paper beneath. Underneath the bracelets was a note in Judith's handwriting, the same careful cursive I recognized from decades of Christmas cards. Some family traditions are worth preserving. Weston went the color of the tissue paper. These are from the twins, he said, barely above a whisper, turning one of the bracelets over like it might explain itself if he found the right angle. The ones who died, except he stopped. He didn't need to finish the sentence. We both understood that a woman doesn't keep 60-year-old hospital bracelets from babies who simply died of natural causes. You keep trophies from things you did. You keep evidence of things you're proud of, tucked away for exactly the kind of moment Judith had just used them for. Not a confession, but a threat, mailed to a pregnant woman from behind bars, telling her precisely what the family was capable of and precisely what she should expect. His phone rang 40 minutes later. Harold. Son, his father said, and something in the single syllable told Weston bad news was coming before another word landed. Your mother made bail. How? Weston said. Judith's assault charge, combined with the domestic violence enhancement and my pregnancy, should have made bail high enough to keep her inside for weeks while the case moved through arraignment. Your brother put up the money. Chase, 28, the golden child of the family in Judith's eyes, precisely because he'd stayed close, stayed agreeable, never asked hard questions about ledgers or bracelets. She's not well, Weston. She keeps talking about fixing things the old way. I don't like the way she sounds. The line went dead before Weston could ask what fixing things the old way meant. We didn't have to wait long to find out. Our doorbell rang a little after 8 that evening. I looked through the peephole first, out of habit more than fear, and saw Judith standing on our porch, flanked by 2 men I'd never laid eyes on in my life. One older older, heavyset. In a windbreaker I'd later learn belonged to a man named Dale Whitcomb, a retired sheriff's deputy who'd known Harold from church for 30 years. The other leaner, more hesitant-looking, hanging back half a step like he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to be there, a man I'd eventually learn was Judith's younger brother, Frank Voss. "Call 911, Weston said, already moving toward the kitchen for his phone, his voice low and fast. I dialed with hands that had started shaking before I'd even finished punching in the numbers. "We're family," Judith called through the door, that same terrible gentleness back in her voice. "We just want to talk about the baby." "Go away," Weston shouted back, standing between the door and where I stood with Marlo already scooped onto my hip, phone pressed to my ear. "The police are coming." "The police can't stop family traditions, son," Judith said. "We've been handling daughters for over a century. Your wife will understand soon." I heard the lock click a half second before I understood what the sound meant. Weston must have understood it faster than I did, because he was already moving, already shouting for me to get upstairs, and I was already running with Marlo hoisted against my hip and my heart slamming against my ribs hard enough to hurt. 8 months pregnant and taking the stairs 2 at a time on legs that didn't feel like they belonged to me. Below me, the door gave way. I found out afterward Dale had a set of lockpicks he'd carried since his deputy days, kept for reasons he never fully explained to the police who arrested him later that night. And then the house filled with noise, shouting, furniture scraping and toppling, Weston's voice raw with effort, and under it, unmistakably, Judith's voice, still calm, still narrating the whole thing like a woman certain she was in the right. I stood at the top of the stairs for 1 full second, torn between running to help my husband and getting my daughter somewhere safe, and I hated that family more in that single second than I had in the entire 8 months before it, for making me choose between the 2 people I loved most in a hallway that used to just be a hallway. Later, Weston would tell me what those minutes downstairs had actually looked like. Dale grabbing him from behind while Judith went for the stairs. Frank standing frozen by the overturned coffee table for what felt like a full minute before something in his face changed, before he grabbed Dale's arm instead of mine, before the 2 men who'd walked in together started fighting each other instead. Weston said he didn't wait to see how that resolved. He said he ran. I got Marlo and myself into the primary bedroom and locked the door, and I called 911 a second time, whispering into the phone that they'd broken in, that Judith had said she was going to hurt my baby, that I needed someone to hurry. Through the door, faint under the sound of my own heartbeat, I heard Judith's voice drift closer, climbing the stairs. "Every woman who brought daughters into this family learned their place eventually," she said, right up against the wood now. "Dead or disappeared. Your turn to choose." Sirens, still distant, her voice closer, almost tender. "Police won't help, dear. We have family in the department. How do you think I made bail so fast?" The doorknob turned, slow, testing, exactly the way it had turned in the moment I opened this story, and now you understand everything that led to it. Everything that made a 61-year-old grandmother believe, with total sincerity, that breaking her own son's door down was simply the family doing what the family had always done. The door splintered near the frame with a crack like a gunshot, and Judith came through it with both hands reaching for me, and I threw the lamp, and it did nothing, and she kept coming, and Marlo was screaming behind me in the corner where I'd shoved her the half second before, and I had exactly one thought clear enough to hold on to. I was not going to let this family's oldest lie become the last thing my daughter ever saw. I didn't wait to find out what Judith intended to do with her hands once they reached me. I grabbed the only other thing within reach, the heavy glass water pitcher from the nightstand, the twin to 100 pitchers exactly like it in 100 ordinary bedrooms, except this one was mine, and it was already moving before I'd finished deciding to move it. It caught Judith across the side of the head. She staggered, one hand flying up to the wound, blood immediately threading down through her silver hair, and in the half second she was off balance, the bedroom door behind her filled with a second shape. Weston, one eye already swelling shut, a torn sleeve, moving so fast he didn't so much tackle his mother as simply become the wall between her and me. "Don't you touch her," he said, and his voice didn't sound like grief anymore. It sounded like something that had finally completely run out of patience for pretending this was fixable. Judith went down hard onto the carpet, Weston's weight pinning her, and for a moment the whole room held still except for Marlo's crying and my own ragged breathing. Judith twisted her head to look up at me from the floor, blood in her hair, and even then, even pinned under her own son with police sirens finally close enough to rattle the windows, she found the composure to say one more thing, quiet enough that I think she meant it only for me. "You'll understand eventually. Every one of us does." "I will never understand you," I said. I said it slow, so there'd be no mistaking a single word of it, so it would land the way I needed it to land. Not as an insult thrown in the heat of a fight, but as a fact, stated plainly, the way you'd read the title of your own life back to yourself. You are not a tradition. You are not a curse. You're just a woman who hurt babies and called it family, and I will spend every day of my daughter's lives making sure they never mistake you for either one. Marlo stayed pressed into the corner behind me the entire time, both small hands over her ears, and it would be months before I stopped hearing that particular silence in my sleep. Not screaming, not crying anymore, just a 4-year-old gone completely quiet in a way children aren't supposed to know how to do. I have never fully forgiven Judith for that alone, separate from everything else, separate from the stitches and the pitcher and the ledger. Some harm doesn't show up on a police report. Some of it just moves into a child's nervous system and waits. The first officers came through the splintered front door 40 seconds later. They found found Dale Whitcomb sitting on our kitchen floor with his nose bleeding and his hands zip-tied by his own belt, courtesy of Frank Voss, who had, somewhere in the chaos downstairs, in a decision he would later describe to police as the only clean thing he'd done in 30 years of going along with his sister, turned on the man he'd come in with and held him down until Weston made it past them both toward the stairs. Frank was sitting beside Dale when police arrived. Not fighting, not fleeing, just sitting with his head in his hands like a man waiting for a verdict he already knew was coming. Upstairs, they found Judith pinned under her son on our bedroom carpet, blood in her hair from the pitcher, still talking, still explaining herself to anyone who'd listen. To the officers now, instead of to me, the audience simply shifting, the performance never breaking stride. "This is a family matter," she told the first officer through the door. "You don't understand what we're protecting." "Ma'am, you're under arrest," the officer said, and it was the first time in 8 months I'd heard anyone say a true sentence to Judith Calloway and watch her have absolutely nothing to say back. Harold arrived at the house 40 minutes later, called by an officer who found his number in Weston's phone. I remember watching him come up our front walk in the porch light, an old man in a cardigan he'd probably thrown on over pajamas, and I remember the exact moment his face changed. Not when he saw the broken door, not even when he saw the blood on our carpet, but when one of the officers, gently, factually, told him what his wife had said through the bedroom door before she broke it down. Harold sat down on our porch steps, right there in front of the ceramic frog Marlowe used to talk to, and put his face in his hands, and I understood, watching him, that some marriages end in a single sentence spoken by a stranger in a police uniform, and this was his. They took Judith out to the ambulance for the head wound before transporting her to booking. She looked at me one more time as they walked her past, hands cuffed in front of her, gauze already taped over the gash the pitcher had left, and for once, she didn't say anything at all. I think that silence frightened me more than anything she'd said all night, because it told me she still believed, even in that moment, that she'd simply lost this particular round, and not that she'd been wrong. Dale Whitcomb was charged with burglary and conspiracy that same night, and the family in the department comment Judith had made through my bedroom door turned out to be true in the ugliest possible way. Dale's former partner on the county sheriff's force, still active, still working, had quietly expedited Judith's bail paperwork as a personal favor, a fact that came out during Dale's own case 3 months later. There was a pension hearing that spring, closed to the public, though the local paper covered the outcome. The officer lost both his job and the pension he'd spent 22 years earning, and Dale himself, once his own plea deal was finalized, got 18 months and lost the concealed carry permit he'd held since his deputy days. I felt nothing like satisfaction reading about it. Mostly, I felt tired, the way you feel tired reading about a house fire 2 streets over from where you used to live. Glad it wasn't yours anymore. Sorry for the people it had touched. Frank Voss was never charged. The county prosecutor took his cooperation, his statement, and the zip-tied evidence of his last-minute change of heart into account and let him walk with a warning, and Frank spent the better part of the next year showing up at our house uninvited every few weeks with casseroles and a look on his face like a man trying to earn back forgiveness. Nobody had actually offered him yet. He told me once, standing on our porch with a foil-covered dish he clearly hadn't cooked himself, that he'd known about the twins his whole life. Not the details, just the shape of it, the family's careful silence around certain names, and had never once asked his sister a direct question about it because some part of him had always preferred not knowing for certain. "I could have asked her 30 years ago," he said. "I chose not to. That's on me as much as it's on her." I didn't disagree with him, and I didn't forgive him either, not fully, but I kept letting him bring the casseroles, because Marlowe liked his terrible jokes, and because a man who finally does the right thing at the last possible second is still, technically, a man who did the right thing. Judith was charged with burglary, aggravated assault, and criminal endangerment of a fetus, on top of the original charges from the dinner. I sat through the arraignment 3 weeks later in a courtroom that smelled like old carpet and coffee, Weston's hand wrapped around mine tight enough to leave marks of its own, and watched Judith enter a not guilty plea in a pressed blazer someone had brought her from home, her chin up, her expression composed, like a woman attending a business meeting rather than answering for what she'd done. The judge set bail high enough this time that no amount of family money moved fast enough to touch it, and I remember the particular relief of watching her get led back out through the side door instead of walking free through the front one. Her attorney tried to argue diminished capacity over the following months, citing her heart condition and a hastily arranged psychiatric evaluation, but the prosecutor had the recorded jail calls. Every one of them, including the handle comment and the some family traditions, are worth reserving note, which the state's forensic document examiner matched conclusively to Judith's handwriting on record from decades of estate paperwork at the funeral home. She pleaded guilty 11 months later, rather than let a jury hear the full contents of that ledger, which by then Preston had helped us dig fully out of page by page with the help of a genealogist he hired out of his own pocket. I wasn't in the courtroom for the plea itself. Weston went alone, said he needed to hear it without me there to watch his face while he heard it, but he told me afterward that Judith had read a short statement to the court, something about family and pressure and a lifetime of believing she was protecting people, and that not once in it had she used the word sorry. 7 years, with parole eligibility after 4. Harold didn't attend the sentencing. The family split the way I imagine most families split when something like this comes out out into the light, unevenly, and not always along the lines you'd expect. Chase, who'd put up Judith's bail without a second thought, spent the following spring in a kind of quiet freefall once the ledger findings became impossible to deny. He'd grown up worshipping the same mythology Judith had fed him his whole life, and watching it collapse into something closer to a confession cost him something I don't think he's fully recovered from even now. He apologized to Weston eventually, a long, halting letter that arrived that November. Weston read parts of it out loud to me at our kitchen table, his voice unsteady in places. "I always thought I was protecting the family by staying close to her," Chase had written. "I understand now I was just protecting the lie. I don't expect you to forgive me for the bail money. I'm not sure I've forgiven myself for it either." Weston wrote back once, briefly, thanking him for the honesty and telling him he needed time. And they haven't spoken much since, though not out of anger. More the way you stop calling an old friend once you realize you don't have much left to say to each other. Harold moved out of the house in Zanesville in October, into a small rental near the funeral home, and filed for divorce the following January. He came by our new place once that winter, unannounced, sitting in his car in our driveway for almost 10 minutes before he worked up the nerve to knock, Weston told me later, having watched him from the front window the whole time. When I opened the door, he had a bag of clementines in one hand, of all things, like a man who'd grabbed the first thing in the grocery store that felt like a peace offering. We sat at the kitchen table while Marlo showed him a drawing of a dinosaur, and at one point, with Marlo out of earshot in the living room, he said quietly, "I keep thinking about the ledger. I worked in that office 30 years and never once opened it past the current year. I told myself that was respect for the dead. I think it was just cowardice with better lighting. I didn't have anything comforting to offer him, so I didn't try." He still writes Marlo letters, actual paper letters with stamps, and he came to Everly's first birthday with a wrapped gift and a look on his face like a man who understood he'd get exactly as much of his granddaughters as we chose to give him, and no more, and had decided that some was better than none. "I don't think he's forgiven himself for the promise he made us before that dinner. No comments about the baby," he'd said, and Judith broke it in under 20 minutes. And I've stopped trying to talk him out of that particular guilt, because some of it, honestly, is his to carry. The genealogist Preston hired found the surviving twin. Grace, the one whose bracelet had been mailed to us in that horrible little package, had in fact been given to a family 2 counties over in 1953, exactly as Preston's grandmother described, and had lived a full life under a different last name entirely, married, raised 3 children of her own, and died in 2015, 8 years before we ever learned she'd existed. But her daughter, a woman named Diane, was still alive, 71 years old, living 40 minutes from us in a town called Coshocton. And when Preston finally worked up the nerve to call her, in the spring after Judith's plea, Diane cried on the phone for 10 straight minutes, and then said she'd always known there was something her mother never talked about, some grief that never quite had a name. I drove out to meet Diane myself a few weeks before Everly's christening, mostly because I wanted to see her face when I told her about the bracelet, and because some part of me needed to give her something the family had taken away from her mother, without her ever knowing it was missing. Diane lived alone in a small house with a garden out front, and she made tea we barely touched, and she asked me question after question. What did Grace's bracelet look like? Was there a middle name on it? Did the family ever say why? Questions I mostly couldn't answer, because the note that had come with it hadn't explained anything, only threatened. "My mother used to say something strange sometimes," Diane told me, turning her mug slowly on the table. "She'd say surviving is its own kind of inheritance. I never knew what she meant. I always assumed she meant the Depression, or losing her own father young. I thought about the ledger, 2 names struck through with one hard line, and told Diane I thought her mother had known more than that, somewhere underneath everything, and had spent her whole life quietly proving a lie about her own existence wrong, without ever having the words to say so out loud." Diane cried again then, quietly this time, and asked if she could see a photo of Everly once she was born, and I promised her she could see more than a photo. She came to Everly's christening that fall. She sat next to me at the reception afterward and held my daughter for a long time, rocking her slightly, humming something under her breath, and I watched a 71-year-old woman meet, in a roundabout and painful way, the family that had tried to erase her mother before she'd ever drawn a single breath of it. There were nights that first year when the grief caught me sideways, not for what Judith had done, which was easier, in a strange way, to be angry about, but for what she could have been. I'd sit up nursing Everly at 3 in the morning and think about the version of Judith who might have existed if someone, anyone, had broken that chain a generation earlier. A grandmother who read to Marlo on the porch, who didn't flinch at the sight of her own granddaughter's face, who might have been, on her best day, exactly the kind of mother-in-law I'd hoped for at that barn reception 4 years earlier. That woman never got the chance to exist, and mourning her felt strange and a little embarrassing, grieving someone who was never real, but I did it anyway, some nights, quietly, while my daughter ate and the house stayed dark and safe around us. Cleaning out the attic before we moved, I found the christening gown Judith had left on our kitchen table all those years earlier, still folded in its tissue paper, still waiting for a boy who was never going to arrive. I sat on the attic floor with it in my lap for a long time. Part of me wanted to burn it, and part of me, the part that still, against every piece of evidence, wished the woman who gave it to me had been capable of something better, wanted to keep it, the way you keep a photograph of someone before you knew what they were. In the end, I donated it to a historical society 2 towns over, a woman there delighted to add an authentic romantic 1930s piece to their collection. No questions asked about where it came from or what it had almost meant for my daughters. It felt like the right kind of ending for it. Something old and beautiful, finally separated from the ugliness that had been folded up inside it for 100 years, put somewhere it could just be lace again and nothing more. My own mother flew in from Arizona 2 days after the break-in and stayed for 6 weeks, sleeping on an air mattress in Marlo's room, cooking more casseroles than Frank ever managed, and never once saying I told you so, even though she'd been quietly wary of Judith since the wedding. Something about the wrist-grabbing toast she'd witnessed from 4 tables away and never fully forgotten. She didn't try to fix anything. She just showed up, day after day, folding laundry and taking Marlo to the park, and sitting with me in the evenings while Weston dealt with lawyers. And somewhere in the 3rd week, she told me, over dishes, that she'd always believed grief and gratitude could occupy the same body at the same time, and that I shouldn't feel guilty for both showing up in the same breath. I think about that a lot now. It turned out to be the truest thing anyone said to me that whole year, delivered by a woman standing at my sink with a dish towel over her shoulder, not a therapist, not a lawyer, just my mother, who had flown across the country because her daughter needed her and hadn't waited to be asked twice. Marlo started seeing a child therapist that fall, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Okafor who specialized in trauma in young children. After her preschool teacher mentioned she'd been drawing the same picture over and over, a house with a broken door and a woman standing outside it. We hadn't realized how much of that night she'd absorbed despite being asleep at my sister's house for most of it. She'd overheard enough in the days after, adult conversations she wasn't supposed to be listening to piece together a version of events that scared her more than the truth would have. Dr. Okafor helped her build a vocabulary for it slowly, over almost a year of Tuesday afternoon sessions. And somewhere around month 8, Marlo stopped drawing broken doors and started drawing our new house instead, always with 4 stick figures out front, always smiling, which felt like its own kind of victory, even though nobody handed us a certificate for it. The court granted a permanent protective order against Judith that spring, effective the moment she's released on parole, covering both girls and extending 20 years, the maximum the judge could issue. Our attorney warned us it was largely symbolic. Judith would be in her late 60s by the time parole became possible, unlikely by any practical measure to show up at a school pickup line, but I asked for it anyway. Needed the piece of paper that said, officially, in language a court would enforce, that this woman was not allowed near my children. Some protections you seek out because you need them. Others you seek out because you need the sentence to exist somewhere outside your own head. Everly was born 6 weeks after the break-in, 3 weeks earlier than her due date. The obstetrician said the stress of that night had almost certainly triggered the early labor, though everything about her arrival, in the end, was healthy and uneventful, and almost anticlimactic after everything that came before it. 7 pounds even. Dark hair, like her sister's, like her father's. Weston cried harder holding her than I'd ever seen him cry at anything, and I understood watching him that some of those tears belonged to relief and some belonged to every single thing his mother had tried and failed to take from this particular child before she'd even drawn breath. Untangling the business took longer than untangling the family in some ways. Harold's divorce meant the funeral home's ownership structure had to be redrawn from scratch. Judith had held a minority share since 1975, and Ohio law didn't simply let that share disappear because of a conviction, so it took the better part of a year, and a lawyer neither Weston nor Harold particularly liked to work out a settlement that bought Judith's stake out entirely, funded partly by a small loan against the property, and partly by funds diverted from what would have gone toward her legal defense had she not pleaded guilty. Weston sat through 4 mediation sessions that spring, thick manila folders on the table, a stranger's calm voice narrating the value of a business his family had run for 5 generations, and came home from each one looking 10 years older than when he'd left. I keep thinking this should feel like justice, he told me after the last session, loosening his tie at our kitchen table. It mostly just feels like paperwork. I told him that was probably what justice looked like from the inside, most of the time. Less a courtroom moment, more a folder full of signatures nobody wanted to sign. We don't live in Zanesville anymore. We moved 40 minutes out to a town with no Callaway and Sons sign anywhere in it, no ledger in a back office with our family's discarded daughters struck through in careful cursive. Weston still owns half the funeral home on paper. Harold couldn't bring himself to sell his half of a business 5 generations deep, and neither, in the end, could Weston, though he's spoken more than once about eventually changing the name on the sign, dropping the "and Sons," replacing it with something that doesn't carry 100 years of quiet cruelty, folded inside 4 ordinary words. He hasn't decided yet. I think some decisions need longer than a year to be ready. Marlo is 7 now. She knows a simplified version of what happened, that her grandmother did something very wrong and hurt people, and is somewhere she has to stay for a long time because of it, and she's never once asked for more detail than that, which I suspect is less about incuriosity and more about some instinct in her, even at 7, that some doors are better left where they are. Everly is 2, loud and stubborn, and utterly unbothered by any of it, exactly as she should be. Neither of them will ever meet the woman who broke into a house to end one of them before she was even born, and I have made a kind of peace with the fact that this is a mercy I was able to give my children that no one gave the women before me in that family. Ruth, institutionalized and dead by 31. Mabel, who spent her whole life pretending a miscarriage instead of a daughter. Grace, who lived a full life never fully knowing wondering why some part of her always felt like a secret. Most mornings now look almost aggressively ordinary, which still catches me off guard sometimes, in a good way. Marlo has a booster seat at the kitchen table covered in stickers she picked out herself. Everly bangs a spoon against her high chair tray and shrieks with laughter at absolutely nothing. Weston makes coffee before he wakes either of them, and some mornings I stand in the doorway and watch him do it. This small, unremarkable domestic thing, and feel a gratitude so specific it almost hurts. Gratitude that our daughters will grow up thinking mornings are supposed to be boring, that a kitchen is supposed to be safe, that a grandmother, if they'd ever had a real one, was supposed to be someone who showed up with clementines and terrible jokes instead of a crowbar. Harold visits every other month now, always calls ahead, always leaves before dinner gets complicated. Diane sends Marlo a birthday card every April with a $5 bill tucked inside, a small ordinary kindness that means more than she probably realizes. Judith writes to Weston sometimes from prison. He reads the letters alone and doesn't tell me what's in them, and I've decided that's his to carry, the same way Harold's guilt is his, and Chase's is his, and mine is mine. I think about the title of this story sometimes, the way I've heard other people tell it back to me. Mother-in-law says no girl survives the bloodline, and I understand why it reads like a curse, why the whole family spent 100 years treating it like one. But it was never a curse. It was a choice, made over and over, generation after generation, by people who found it easier to erase their daughters than to examine why they were so afraid of them. My daughters survived, not because of luck, not because the curse finally broke on its own, but because at some point, in a bedroom with a splintered door and blood on the carpet, I decided I would rather be hit with everything that family had than hand either one of my girls over to what they called tradition. That's the part of the story nobody puts in the title. Survival was never given to us. We took it, and it cost more than I can fully explain, and some days the cost still sits in my chest like something unfinished. But my daughters are alive, and they are loved without condition, and they will grow up never once wondering if their names belong in a ledger with a line struck through them. That is the whole inheritance I ever wanted to give them, and it is, finally, mine to give.